Did you know that in January 2023, the World Economic Forum's Davos Summit had strict testing and even masking mandates? Attendees had to do PCR tests to be allowed in. Drivers and staff were required to mask. The summit provided free N95 masks to all, and HEPA filters and state-of-the-art UVGI/far UVC disinfectant systems were placed throughout the venues. I don't know what that is. Oh, that's expensive. Guess I'm too poor to know what that is. But weren't many of these same politicians and thought leaders, or whatever you want to call them, telling us that COVID was over and mandating that we return to work without any protections? In the next 4 months following the conference, America alone experienced over 30,000 deaths. And in response, the state of emergency was lifted in May. We were told the pandemic was over by a president who uses services like EventScan to test all attendees prior to an event, and still required tests before meetings.
So as you know, we have testing protocols when anytime somebody meets with the president.
We've been told it's safe to send our children back to poorly ventilated schools with no masks by people like Ashish Jha and Rochelle Walensky, who send their children to a school district which invested $5 million in ventilation upgrades as early as September of 2020. Or they send their kids to private schools. Schools like Abram. I'm too poor to know how to say that. Their tuition fees are over $18,000 annually. Right now, in the year of our Lord 2024, they require high-quality masks, updated vaccines, HEPA filters in every classroom, and daily testing of students, teachers, families, and visitors. So what's that about?
Telling people what they want to hear sounds like the worst thing you could possibly do in a pandemic.
I'm not afraid of the coronavirus.
The flu has a mortality of 0.1%. This has a mortality of 10 times that.
You no longer need to wear a mask.
I'm sorry, America has mass graves.
Explicitly pursued a strategy to spread the virus.
And we'll smile again. Greeting others with a smile. With a smile.
I try to limit the number of clips in my videos of sensitive content, but we are talking about a pandemic, so content warning for discussions of mass death, severe illness, and, as always, systemic ableism. Hello, and welcome to my channel. I'm Leslie XP, and I'm reintroducing myself because I haven't made a video in over a year. After my video warning everyone about the plague, I, ironically, got it. Twice. And I'm still dealing with long-term issues now. I guess God had to nerf me again. I entirely stand by everything I said in the first video, and in fact would like to use this opportunity to add, "Fuck you, I told you so." You don't need to watch that video to watch this one, just hang out, relax, open it in another tab, and intend to get to it for the next week. Nearly everyone seems to think we've gone back to normal, but these same people are suddenly dealing with odd health problems. Colds are lasting for weeks or months at a time. And children are being hospitalized and dying from regular childhood illnesses like strep and RSV. People will argue that COVID is endemic now. Time to stop living in fear, sheeple. Take off your mask like everyone else. Keep catching it to train your immune system. You know, like how in areas where malaria is endemic, people just keep getting it to build up immunity, and no one has mosquito nets or kills mosquitoes or gets updated shots or... Oh wait, no, that's not how that works at all. Maybe. Hear me out. Living with a disease doesn't have to mean being ruined by it. We are collectively destroying everyone's health by spreading this around. I know this is hard to hear. I know you've been told it's safe, but it's not safe. Take a deep breath. You can always start doing better and prevent further damage. If you care about literally anyone, including yourself, including your kids, including your pets, for the holy love of Satan and Christ, wear a mask, filter your air, test regularly, and stay home if you're sick. It's what the rich and powerful are still doing. The Koch network's propaganda campaign. I got this comment on my last video urging me to follow the money. So I did. As far back as March 2020, the Koch network is already issuing statements via various organizations expressing their opposition to pandemic precautions.
Are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren?
Anyone with a stake in fossil fuel, real estate, or literally any market that needs people out of the house and consuming would prefer people keep getting sick. It's not just the Koch family who oppose precautions, of course. They're just a well-known and well-documented example. If your preferred enemy is Big Pharma, well, pharmaceutical companies don't make money off people staying home, wearing masks, and not getting sick. They make money off of people actually being sick, and then raising the price of Paxlovid to $1,390 per course of treatment once government stock runs out, which will happen sometime this year. The only companies who would profit from people taking precautions during a pandemic are delivery companies and PPE manufacturers, and these have nowhere near the political influence or lobbying money as fossil fuel, real estate, and pharmaceutical companies. Before we get into it, let's just make this clear. This is not a conspiracy about globalists or anything even specific to the Koch network. It doesn't have to be. This is just basic market logic. The Koch family could have done nothing, and we'd still be in the same place today because some other billionaires would have taken their place. I'm absolutely not saying a secret cabal came together and decided to join forces to disable us. This is completely in line with the tenets of economic shock therapy. If you value profits over human life, or have deluded yourself into thinking increased profits somehow equates to improved lives, then you'll inevitably come to the same conclusions about what to do about a pandemic. It happened in 1918, too. This isn't secret knowledge. They're using the same formula. They're gonna get the same answers. And if you don't think businesses will kill and maim an entire population, including their own workers, for profit, then what are you doing in this part of YouTube, kiddo? Go watch a skibbity toilet. Anyway, the Koch network did the standard astroturfing thing.
Participants for a number of anti-lockdown rallies were recruited by FreedomWorks, a dark money group tied to Charles Koch, instrumental in organising the Tea Party protests of 2009. Several of the 2020 rallies were also promoted by the Convention of State Action, a group founded by an organisation with ties to the Koch network and hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer that wants to rewrite the US Constitution.
But too many people were still listening to science and were still concerned about their loved ones dying or whatever. So what else could the poor disenfranchised Koch network do? They had to collect their own cabinet of experts and intellectuals. And they even invented some for good measure. The Great Barrington Declaration is an open letter published on October 5th, 2020, that was reportedly signed by over 15,000 medical and public health scientists, stating that
the most compassionate approach that balances the risks and benefits of reaching herd immunity is to allow those who are at minimal risk of death to live their lives normally, to build up immunity to the virus through natural infection.
They called this focus protection. Might I remind you that we already understood COVID could cause long-term permanent damage. There were already documented cases of reinfection, and Paxlovid and vaccines were not yet available when this was published, which makes the phrase natural infection particularly insidious. This statement promoted several very important lies, one of which nearly everyone has come to believe, namely the lie that there exists a population who's not at risk of COVID complications. But how did this open letter come about? This not-so-great declaration was signed at a conference hosted by the American Institute for Economic Research, which also registered the declaration's website, and also happens to be a Koch-tied libertarian think tank associated with climate change denial. So, who are the experts who signed this letter anyway? Well, for one, the eminent Dr. Johnny Bananas, and at his side, the venerated Professor Dominic Dummings. They even got a signature from a resident at the University of Your Mom, and another whose name was the entire first verse of the Macarena. This letter has since been cited by senators, congresspeople, and the former President of the United States. There were also real people who signed this, like physician, economist, and full-time bootlicker Jay Bhattacharya. What a piece of shit. In 2020, he ran a widely criticized and poorly conducted study funded by the founder of JetBlue Airways that just happened to prove that COVID wasn't a big deal. Well, isn't that convenient for the airline industry? I would rather trust Dr. Johnny Bananas than any of these shills. In October 2020, when it was published, the whole notion of mass infection and herd immunity was widely dismissed by public health experts, and most countries carried on with precautions. However, former reality TV star and sentient McMansion Donald J. Trump was the President of the United States at the time, and if you think for a second he would listen to an opinion he doesn't like over one he does like, then I'm really sorry to hear about that coma you've been in. Before the Declaration was even drafted, he had hosted its authors at the White House. They were already buddies, and he fell in love with their high fantasy sci-fi concept of
the herd mentality. It's going to be
herd immunity to COVID. It would be so marketable. Imagine the drama. An entire population infected. But through their sacrifice, they saved the economy. And, less importantly, rid the entire world of the plague. His COVID advisor at the time, Scott Atlas, was a neuroradiologist with no background in infectious diseases. So, he didn't see any problem with the approach.
It's actually good news that the virus spreads widely because that means that we have a better chance of developing population immunity.
And so the fantasy spread, and so did COVID, which only gave the virus more opportunity to mutate and outrun any possibility of herd immunity via vaccination or otherwise. Before this declaration was even published, some states began dropping precautions. In Florida, where I tragically live, Ron DeSantis allowed parents to defy school mask mandates as early as August 2020. He ordered businesses to reopen and barred the enforcement of mask mandates in November of 2020. The result is that Florida has become a plague hotspot, accounting for nearly 1 in 5 U.S. cases in the summer of 2021. I personally know only one person in this entire state who hasn't tested positive at least once. Another libertarian think tank, heavily funded by the Koch family, called Mercatus Center, began funding a database run by Emily Oster, an economist who has argued that the drawbacks of school closures outweigh the risks of exposure. Let me just repeat her credentials relevant to evaluating the risks of infecting children repeatedly with what, at the time, was an unknown pathogen and is now known to cause long-term immune and vascular damage. An economist. This is where many of the key lies regarding children have been spread from. For instance, the lie that COVID doesn't impact children's health at all, proven verifiably false by numerous studies, including this one that shows there's a 78% higher risk of new onset conditions after infection in children. Oster's work was cited by DeSantis when he signed the order in August 2020 allowing parents to defy school mask mandates. Several of these think tanks have even attempted to push the narrative that government intervention is what makes pandemics so deadly. The Foundation for Economic Education, another Koch-funded nonprofit, even went so far as to claim that naive government interventions were responsible for a rise in global malaria cases. So, I guess my little joke earlier about people not using mosquito nets and haha, malaria is endemic, haha, that was not a joke. That was kind of not a joke. And keep in mind, these same billionaires and economic thought leaders, or whatever you want to call them, attended the World Economic Forum in Davos and took tests, masked, and used HEPA filters in January of 2023 after telling us for 3 years since 2020 that COVID is not a concern. Javid Yami, MD, MPH, a professor of global health and public policy at Duke University, remarked,
"You have to hand it to the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. They have had extraordinary access to the very highest levers of government. They've had a profound impact on policy making. Time and time again, we've seen the people behind the Great Barrington Declaration get what they want."
How to Hide a Plague. Part 1. Fucking Libs. Sure, Trump had his delusions of herd immunity, but when he was in office, the general population was still taking COVID pretty seriously. At least the libs were. So what happened? Did our Lord and Savior Joe Biden eliminate COVID and personally kiss everyone's boo-boos? Yeah, nothing really changed at all. If anything, it got worse. Honestly, in hindsight, I get why people were reluctant to get the vaccines. Libs, especially the Biden administration, treated us like petulant children if we expressed any hesitation or pointed out that they were anything less than perfect. And I say this as someone who is fully vaxxed and boosted and thinks everyone else should be too. Joe Biden's whole public health policy boiled down to
Go get vaccinated. Now. Now. You no longer need to wear a mask. If you're a good little vaxxed up Discord kitten daddy, we'll let you remove your mask.
which was maybe the worst strategy, as people pointed out at the time, because obviously unvaccinated Karens fighting mask mandates aren't going to mask, especially once it's even slightly optional or socially acceptable. You can't tell if someone has been vaccinated just by looking at them. There's no way to enforce it. And maybe that was the point. The vaccine did offer robust protection at first, but then CDC Director Rochelle Walensky did not have the data in March of 2021 to proclaim,
we can kind of almost see the end. We're vaccinating so very fast. Our data from the CDC today suggests, that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick.
Her comments were quickly walked back by the CDC, but the damage was done. When it became clear people were still getting infected despite vaccination, mainstream news sources reported breakthrough infections were rare. Nothing to worry about. Totally fine and expected. But the virus was still mutating. The CDC and the mainstream media kept reporting best-case scenarios and pushing this vaccine-only strategy rather than being realistic. They knew that vaccines were not the silver bullet of the pandemic. They even knew mask mandates were effective. Yet they still pushed them over masks because of optics. Businesses hated masks from the beginning. They made the pandemic too visible. Masks make people feel anxious about germs and change their consumption habits, and importantly, they make facial recognition software less effective. This propaganda pretty immediately appealed to the Trump crowd, but when Dems got into office, they too insulted masks at every opportunity.
The scarlet letter of this pandemic is the mask. It may be painless, it may be easy, but it's inconvenient, it's annoying, and it reminds us that we're in the middle of a pandemic.
They rebranded masking with new liberal shame.
Oh, you're still masking? That must mean you haven't gotten your vaccine. Oh, you're still masking? That must mean you don't trust science. Oh, you're still masking. If that's what helps your anxiety, then you do you.
Delta hit. It was clear vaccines were offering some protection, but not enough to stop people from catching it and spreading it around. For a time, 95% of deaths were of unvaccinated people. So liberals pushed vaccines even harder. People who were dying were branded as vulnerable populations who should take extra precautions, while the public was given endless assurances that they would be fine, as long as they were vaccinated. In other words,
the most compassionate approach is to allow those who are at minimal risk of death to live their lives normally.
Like focusing, protection. Where did I hear that from before? Oh yeah, that sure does look kind of exactly like what was proposed by the Great Barrington Declaration in 2020 by conservative think tanks, back when Dems were appalled and disgusted by the cruelty of culling the weak. Dems clutched their pearls in November of 2020, then by June 2021, adopted this strategy without even the fantasy of herd immunity to cling on to. Separating the vulnerable during Delta wasn't proposed as a way to control infection at all. It was literally just a way to keep the economy going. This is also when the language of COVID surges became upticks, a much cuter word that makes me less scared. Then Omicron, the so-called mild variant, hit. 150,000 people died in 8 weeks in the US. 40% of them were vaccinated. Did you know this mild branding was based on a single study out of South Africa? This study did not compare Omicron outcomes to the original virus, only to the Delta variant, which was more severe than the original virus. Later analysis found Omicron to be equally as severe as earlier strains when controlling for vaccination status. But the rebranding of COVID as mild was already done. Personal responsibility. From this New York Times article, Two COVID Americas, on January 25, 2022.
Many Democrats say that they feel unsafe in their communities, are worried about getting sick from COVID, and believe the virus poses a significant risk to their children, parents, and friends. Republicans are less worried about each of these issues. Who's right? There is no one answer to that question, because different people have different attitudes toward risk.
Who's right? The scaredy cat Dems or the unbothered Republicans? Oh, who can say? It's not like we have science or medicine or data or anything. This quote puts both positions on equal footing and implies the difference is only in how much people value risk. The narrative pushed by mainstream sources like the New York Times became one of anxiety about catching COVID. Precautions were no longer about community care and public health, but personal anxiety. The discourse became about risk level and separating the vulnerable from everyone else, and telling us to take personal responsibility for our risk level. To quote this article, the media, in order to prop up the incompetent Biden administration, successfully cast those who continue to be harmed as an outgroup that exists outside the social contract of community care. The genius of this outgroup is that it expands to accommodate all comers. You can be a mask-hating COVID denialist in June. If you've got long COVID by December, your days being featured as an expert or making policy decisions are over. Now, you're just another whiny patient who should get more exercise. Mainstream sources also began to push the narrative of immunity debt, the lie that getting sick often actually makes you healthy. It doesn't. But what about those far-left communist 87 gender states like California, burdening employers with mask and testing mandates? Well, let's look at a little case that went to the California Supreme Court. In 2020, Victory Woodworks blatantly disregarded the public health guidelines California had at the time and didn't test or enforce safety measures for newly transferred employees, who they knew may have had COVID. Naturally, the plaintiff, Robert Kusiemba, got COVID from these transferred workers, which he then passed on to his wife, who ended up in the ICU on a ventilator for weeks. And because this is America, this cost his family thousands of dollars in addition to the trauma of watching his wife nearly die. He decided to sue his workplace for blatantly disregarding public health guidelines. Can you guess what the ruling was? Yeah, obviously the court decided the employer was not liable for what has been so adorably termed take-home COVID. Like it's one of those coloring pages you used to get from daycare. The ruling itself is not surprising. However, the logic behind it, laid out explicitly by the court, is a rare and horrifying instance of the state telling on itself in no uncertain terms. The California Supreme Court just ruled against Kusiemba on the basis that a victory, while, in the court's words, morally the right thing to do, would create dire financial consequences for employers and cause a dramatic expansion of liability to stop the spread of COVID. The ruling was clear. Yes, it was both legally and morally wrong for Victory Woodworks to ignore public health ordinances. However, we can't give you this one, because who are you? You don't own a business. Ruling in favor of workers' rights, in this case, the court argued, would simply open the floodgates to too many cases. It would cost poor corporations too much in legal fees if employees subjected to unsafe working conditions were able to sue. It would set a dangerous precedent of valuing human life over employer interest. This ruling essentially helps codify workplace mass infection and justifies it as necessary for the smooth functioning of capitalism. So mask and quarantine precautions were officially up to states to decide, but really it was up to businesses. And now it's entirely up to individuals. The
depoliticization.
Okay, it sounds like they don't know how to say it either. The
depoliticization
of COVID continue to the point where the Speaker for the White House will now respond with utter disdain if you so much as suggest they do literally anything about it.
Does the White House think more hospitals across the country should be considering that right now?
The masking piece, that is, and we've always been very consistent on this. That is something that is localized, or hospitals, communities, cities, states, they have to make their own decisions. That's not something that we get involved in.
In this 60 Minutes interview from September 2022, Joe Biden said,
"The pandemic is over."
Damn, I guess someone should have told that to the hundreds of thousands of people who died, and the millions who've become permanently disabled since then. Can you guess when the Victory Woodworks court case was decided? When the California Supreme Court officially ruled that there was just too much COVID going around to hold employers liable for preventing spread? July 6, 2023. 10 months after Joe Biden said the pandemic was over on television, and 2 months after the federal public health emergency was lifted. So we exist in a world where the president has declared the pandemic over, but the courts ruled that there was so much COVID going around that our justice system literally could not handle all of the lawsuits. So which is it? I don't have time to outline every shitty thing liberals did to undermine public health and get us to this place. If you want more of this discussion, I'd recommend this Death Panel episode called How Liberals Killed Masking, and the one specifically about the California court case called Unlimited Liabilities. Just generally, you should listen to that podcast. It's good. It's true Joe Biden didn't change anything, but we did at least get to witness liberal hypocrisy play out in real time. To quote this article,
Joe Biden's presidency didn't bring an end to the pandemic. It brought an end to the conditions that allowed the masses to more seriously uncover the hidden horrors of capitalism.
How to Hide a Plague, Part 2, the CDC. So what's even the proof that COVID is still a problem? You're surely asking me. Well, even while deaths are likely being undercounted, deaths from COVID have still never dropped below 300 per week. From August 26, 2023 to March 16, 2024, deaths did not drop below 1,000 per week. And these numbers don't even account for deaths from long-term complications. But we'll have more on that later. This is a graph of wastewater concentrations of SARS-CoV-2, and this shaded region is recorded case numbers of COVID. These wastewater concentration numbers were adjusted to approximate case numbers, which can be tricky. But when public health measures were in place and people were testing frequently, wastewater matched with case numbers almost exactly for over a year. So what happened? Why are wastewater concentrations still so high? In fact, these are the second highest wastewater levels of the entire pandemic. But case numbers? Well, it looks like there's hardly any cases. Oh, boy, that sure is odd. Redefining risk. Hey, look at this risk map from March 17th, 2022. It's so red. And then, just minutes later, using the exact same data, it's so green. Green makes me feel safe. That's so weird. It's almost like the CDC decided to redefine risk overnight. They did. That is exactly what happened. They raised the threshold for what's an acceptable number of cases, defining as many as 200 cases per 100,000 as low, when this previously would have been considered high just moments before. And now we don't even have that. Check out their new wastewater maps in soothing social media blue. Notice in Nevada, where my mouse happened to hover when I took this screenshot, there's only one site reporting for the entire state. That's not nearly enough data to cover 128 cities spread over 110,000 square miles. But case numbers aren't being reported due to at-home testing. And due to pressure from the federal government, daily hospitalizations and deaths aren't being reliably reported anymore either. We can look up how many rounds of Paxlovid have been prescribed, around 250,000 courses per week in September. We can look at sick days, we can look at applications for long-term disability, but let's just pause and think about these back alley, ass-backward ways we have to search for accurate information. You shouldn't need a research degree to understand your risk of catching COVID. What happened to the pretty graphs and visualizers? The CDC is presenting what statistics they have by percent change in cases and deaths and hospitalizations. Percent change from what, exactly? Well, like I said, the official death count hidden under this percent change bullshit has been over 1,000 dead between August and March. You know how I found that out? Well, I found out from this podcast, but you know how they found out? They had to locate and go through a spreadsheet of deaths. A spreadsheet. Like we're doing niche research on the effect of exogenous androgens in Himalayan mealworms, and not something that, according to wastewater, an estimated 1 in 30 people in my region are currently infected with. And yes, I do know these estimates for case numbers based on wastewater are vague guesses, but I do think it's still useful to express the scale in more concrete terms, and I don't currently have better metrics. But Leslie, I hear you saying, what about vaccination? What about Paxlovid? Isn't it just not a big deal to get COVID? Isn't it just a cold? I'll have more about this in the section titled, Not a Cold. And you can also watch this video by Lola Germs, who will do an even better job walking you through the science than I can. But the short answer is no. Better treatments and vaccines have significantly reduced cases of hospitalizations and deaths during the acute phase of the disease. That is, when you're showing symptoms. Which is great, genuinely. But this reported death toll does not account for death and disability due to the long-term impacts of COVID, which are so thoroughly researched that even the CDC has to acknowledge them. An estimated 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 cases will lead to long COVID. Cases, not people. By your 6th infection, there's an over 50% chance that you will have long COVID. From this research briefing out of New Zealand, some people who are currently well post-COVID are already expressing biomarkers of risk for cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disorders, a range of autoimmune diseases, and cancers. Conditions that typically have latency periods lasting years or decades. To be only 4 years in and already see these elevated biomarkers should be deeply concerning. Latency periods are not new to medical research, certainly not new to the CDC. HPV can take decades to become active and cause cancer. Epstein-Barr virus, which can cause multiple sclerosis, typically does so 10 years after initial infection. And HIV initially presents as a little cold, then has a latency period of 8 to 15 years before you have symptoms of AIDS. For the CDC to minimize the long-term dangers of an infection without sufficient evidence is not unprecedented. It is very precedented. This current trends update from 1985 states, the fact that 2/3 of men infected for over 5 years have not developed AIDS or AIDS-related illness is an encouraging indication that infection with this virus is not necessarily followed by rapid development of symptoms and death. Encouraging.
Really encouraging.
This was what was being communicated about AIDS in the mid-80s. AIDS deaths peaked in the early 90s. Do you really think we can trust what the CDC has to say now?
And yes, really encouraging news in the context of Omicron.
Over 720,000 Americans have been killed by COVID in the acute phase since vaccines were available. That's more Americans than have died in any war. Vax and relax was a liberal lie. I don't know what to tell you if you think hundreds of thousands of excess deaths is acceptable or normal. Plus, obviously, there are plenty of people who can't get the vaccine or take certain meds due to other health conditions. And what are they supposed to do? But why have these data been so abstracted? Why did the CDC change protection recommendations? Recently released meeting notes have revealed exactly what disability activists have suspected all along. The CDC elected to prioritize employer interests over public health. Like the California court case, social murder is spelled out explicitly in black and white. We care more about airlines making money than we do about your life. And this is just the notes they're willing to release. The 5-day quarantine, then 5 days masking recommendation is unscientific bullshit supported only by the hopes and dreams of the CEO of Delta Airlines. You should still be isolating for a full 10 days after a positive test or exposure. Ideally, isolate until you have no symptoms and have 2 negative tests done 48 hours apart. But, of course, who the hell has that kind of PTO? Who can afford to take that many tests? Who can afford to buy so many masks? Yeah, that's kind of exactly the problem. Though, trust me, chronic illness is way more expensive than masks, tests, and vaccines. At-home testing, the CDC redefining risk levels, and vaccines and Paxlovid reducing hospitalizations and deaths in the acute phase have all obfuscated the actual prevalence of COVID and the real long-term risks of infection. Due to these reasons, the People's CDC advises making your COVID safety decisions based on wastewater concentrations, which are sparse, but are still being reliably tracked, unlike cases or hospitalizations or deaths. How to turn plague into profit. So, the United States unironically went to war with COVID on the side of COVID. But why? Why, you might be asking? Would it ever possibly be more profitable to disable your workforce than to take care of them? Well, call me an optimist, but I don't think disabling everyone was the intention. But it certainly wasn't a deterrent. And I suspect down the line, this push for normal may ultimately not be profitable for many of the same industries which pushed for it initially. I think Delta Airlines will find bedbound people don't tend to travel much. Now, of course, this mass disabling event can be exploited as a happy accident for many, don't get me wrong. And those in power were quick to take advantage of the opportunity. Before Americans were officially informed about the pandemic, several senators managed to secure a nice profit. Allegedly. The day after a confidential briefing on the virus, Senator Kelly Loeffler and her husband, who happens to be chair of the Intercontinental Stock Exchange, made 27 trades worth between $1.2 and $3.1 million. On February 7th, Senator Richard Burr wrote an editorial assuring the public we were prepared and everything's fine, and then quietly sold between $628,000 and $1.7 million worth of stock. And, in a leaked recording from February 27th, said,
"There's one thing that I can tell you about this. It is much more aggressive in its transmission than anything that we have seen in recent history."
Senator David Perdue made 112 transactions and acquired $825,000 worth of stock in DuPont, a company that makes PPE and body bags. No charges were brought against any of these representatives, and all investigations are closed. Awfully good timing on those trades, though. We did at least get this video of Legal Eagle responding to the situation.
Hey, Legal Eagles, it's time to think like a lawyer, and maybe get out the pitchforks and guillotines, because it might be time for some senatorial heads to roll.
I'm not even getting into the rollout of PPP loans, which were ostensibly for small businesses, but mostly went to people making well over $100,000 per year. You see, there's this thing called disaster capitalism. Oh look, another link for you to open in a new tab and ignore for the next week. Or you can read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which, according to the acknowledgments, was initially inspired by the AIDS crisis. Rest in piss, Donald Rumsfeld. Disaster capitalism can look like investing in industries that profit from tragedy while inflating the price of essential resources. Like investing in a company which produces body bags. Or investing in a pharmaceutical company that produces a life-saving AIDS treatment priced at $15,000 per year. But it's also about taking advantage of a desperate, destabilized, and/or marginalized populace to push through legislation benefiting corporate interests that any halfway politically engaged population would otherwise protest. Like, for instance, the WTO outlawing the manufacture of generic alternatives to a $15,000 HIV drug, which could be sold at a fraction of the price. To quote Naomi Klein in an article about this pandemic,
"In moments of crisis, people tend to focus on the daily emergencies of surviving that crisis, whatever it is, and tend to put too much trust in those in power."
Those benefiting from crisis, called shock doctors by Klein, might also want to shift the mainstream narrative to one of personal responsibility and education. Doing your own research, if you will. Obfuscating and not even acknowledging the systemic reasons why people are pushed into unsafe conditions. In relation to the AIDS crisis,
report after report concludes that increased knowledge does not assist women to avoid risky sexual behavior. Their financial desperation is grave enough to outweigh concerns about their own health. In other words, women are willing to risk one health threat, HIV, in order to stave off another more immediate one, hunger.
In April of 2020, Kambale Musavali, a Congolese human rights activist, stated,
"You are providing the population with two choices. Either you die from hunger or you die from COVID-19. And the population are saying, well, I'd rather die from COVID-19. I need to feed my family, and people are still moving around."
Employees at In-N-Out are no longer allowed to mask in almost all states unless they have a medical exemption. I personally have 4 friends who can no longer wear masks at work without the risk of being written up or otherwise losing employment opportunities. One of these friends was out of work for 2 months and sent out over 400 job applications before finally being hired at their new workplace. They've chosen to risk infection over houselessness, and I can't say I blame them. Meanwhile, the wealthy think they can buy health. And they're right, kind of. For more about this plague for thee but not for me mentality, read Let Them Eat Plague, linked in my sources document. There are obviously significant disparities in health outcomes across social class and marginalization. The wealthier and whiter and less queer you are, the better off you'll be, and the less likely you are to support public health measures. To quote Beatrice Adler Bolton, "You are entitled to the survival you can buy." Health, in a capitalist society, is a commodity. And the people who can afford it don't think the rest of us have a right to it. And there are advantages to keeping a class of disabled workers in commodified disabled bodies. Disabling a population necessarily means gaining more control over that population. Not due to apathy or inability to organize on the part of disabled people, but due to both the limitations of our bodies and the prevalence of carceral control over disabled bodies. Mass incarceration, institutionalization in care facilities, guardianships, enforced poverty, and loss of legal rights like marriage rights and the ability to emigrate to new countries ensures that disabled bodies remain, at best, commodities for so-called care industries, and at worst, a boogeyman to scare the working poor into working more. Nursing homes are good business. In this article, Beatrice Adler Bolton noted that, as the proportion of nursing home residents covered under Medicaid hit a record high, the average amount of revenue from Medicaid reimbursement also hit its own record high at $214 a day in the third quarter of that year. Each person, as a body and nothing more, is an asset worth an average of just over $78,000 annually. For more on how disabled people are transformed into commodities, read Health Communism by Beatrice Adler Bolton and Artie Vierkant. Or just look up the term extractive abandonment and read something shorter. Imani Barbarin eloquently summarized the state of things.
People seem to believe that this is like a fumble by the government and the media. No, this was an investment. And that's because of the billionaires in their ear. We talk about the rich and the wealthy in terms of them halting COVID mitigation, but we rarely talk about the other side of it. And that is that private equity firms have been buying up disability services, as well as investing in guardianship and conservatorship. Valuable as a disabled person, baby. They can imprison you using the legal system, and then you pay them for the pleasure. You take away all your assets. Then they'll shove you into a nursing home or a long-term care facility where they're cutting corners, so you're surrounded by death every day. It'll also be easier to take your children from you, because disability makes you an unfit parent, don't you know? Ableism is a closed loop of a system. If you speak out or try to talk to anybody, you not only control who you talk to, people won't believe you're disabled.
If we can make long COVID and expensive health issues the norm, then people will not only be putting more money in the pockets of pharmaceutical companies and care facilities, but they'll be even more desperate for work to pay off medical bills or take care of loved ones. People will have even less energy to fight against policies which take away our rights. It's generally best for capital if you're desperate, willing to work for whatever wage you can get, and then, when you physically can't work anymore, you hand over the few pennies you managed to save for the privilege of dying in a rat-infested hole in the wall that the owning class uses to embezzle your Social Security money. Not a cold. Well, that was dark, but don't worry, it's about to get darker. Extra content warning for this part. If you already have severe health anxiety and you're masking and taking precautions, you can go ahead and skip to the next section. I also talk about mental health and sex a little bit, but it's not in a lot of detail. This is not normal. Don't you remember when your family could go a year, or even 2 years, without getting sick? Haven't you noticed people are sick nearly all the time now? When I was in school, it was not normal for children to miss weeks of class due to illness. I know this because I was really the only one doing that back then. It's not normal for kids to be sick this often. It's not normal for strep to hospitalize them. It's not normal for so many people to be unable to work. Stop and think. How many times do you plan on catching COVID in your life? By your 6th infection, you have an over 50% chance of long COVID. An estimated 1 in 5 cases of COVID will lead to long COVID. Cases, not people. The damage is cumulative. If you've had COVID before, you are more susceptible due to the immune damage from a prior infection. It doesn't matter how active and fit you are. Though it varies in severity, about 18% of people with long COVID haven't been able to work for over a year, according to this 2023 report by the New York State Insurance Fund. At least 65 million people globally have long COVID. It's not rare, and it's not mild. Ask me how I know. In July of 2021, I hiked 5 miles up a mountain, set up a campsite, had sex, and then the next day hiked 5 miles back with several pounds of rocks added to my backpack, and had sex again, with someone else. We like to have consensual fun here. I tell you this to give you my baseline. You know how these stories go. It'll all be relevant later. While I have disabilities that prevent me from working, I've always been pretty physically active. The first time I got COVID in September 2022, it hit while I was a mile away from my car carrying a bucket of rocks and dodging waves at Lake Superior. I was 29 years old, in good shape, and regularly exercised. I've never smoked. I was not someone who was considered one of the vulnerable. I didn't even qualify for Paxlovid. Because of being in disability spaces online, I knew how bad it could be, but I still had this sense that I was healthy enough and informed enough to be fine. And during the acute stage, it really just felt like a bad cold. I got over all the usual symptoms in like a week. I slowed down for another week because I'd read about the need for rest, and then resumed my normal level of activity. Which, yes, was too soon. 2 weeks later, I was in the emergency room. My heart rate was 130 beats per minute. I had been shaking uncontrollably for hours. It felt like I was being stabbed in the head and chest. I couldn't tolerate light or sound. My legs were too weak to walk. I could barely hold up my own head. It wasn't a panic attack. I've had panic attacks before. All the anxiety reduction techniques I know did nothing to lower my heart rate or reduce tremors. And what would I be panicking about anyway? The illness was over. I'd recovered. They gave me an IV and a migraine cocktail and sent me home. The shaking got better for a day or two, but it kept returning, often in the middle of my sleep. My heart rate kept suddenly spiking at 120 beats per minute or more, seemingly at random. I'd just be relaxing, watching TV, and suddenly my heart would decide I was running a marathon. The migraine symptoms were nearly constant. The clink of silverware on plates nearly took me out, multiple times. I couldn't hold on to a thought for more than a minute. My body felt so weak. I felt like maybe I was dying. My doctor suggested it was a secondary infection and prescribed an antibiotic. An infection with no fever, congestion, or body aches? Sure, okay. The ER had ruled out the most serious stuff, stroke, blood clot, heart attack, and subsequent blood tests would rule out diabetes, vitamin deficiencies, and common cancers. I understood my symptoms were most likely long COVID pretty immediately, even if my doctor wasn't willing to acknowledge the possibility, and I knew there wasn't really much she could do about it anyway. I knew the prognosis was variable. I didn't know if I could ever recover. I didn't know if my symptoms would progress. I didn't know if I could die from whatever was going on with my body. But I was in the best possible position to recover. I don't depend on work, I already receive Social Security benefits, I have stable housing and live with my family who could bring me food, water, and meds. I rested. For months. I paced myself. I started a low-inflammation diet. I took antihistamines and NSAIDs and supplements and probiotics and electrolytes. After 2 months, I could walk downstairs. Some days. Most days. 3 months later, I was able to go for short walks in the neighborhood. I was starting to feel functional again. I thought the worst was over. On December 31st, 2022, I was back in the emergency room. I was dehydrated from vomiting the entire night. I was, again, shaking uncontrollably and unable to tolerate light or form coherent sentences. I tested positive for COVID. Happy New Year. Weirdly, I don't remember having any fevers or even coughing all that much from my second infection. I just remember the neurological symptoms and dysautonomia, because that lasted for months, and still comes back sometimes. Months of being bedbound in the dark, barely able to remember the podcast I was trying to listen to in order to distract myself from the intense discomfort of tremors and heart palpitations and dizziness, and a lingering worry that I don't really know what's happening, and maybe I could die from this, whatever it was. Though I comforted myself by remembering I had already partially recovered once. I could only sometimes tolerate any light, smells, sounds, or touch. The second time was worse than the first, as you likely have guessed based on the fact I haven't made a video since 2022. I'd say it felt like I was a mind trapped in a body, but I didn't even have the brain power to feel like I had a mind at all. I had new symptoms, temperature dysregulation, and even more severe brain fog. It was a major accomplishment when I was finally able to regularly sit up and watch TV. I think it was about a month before I got to that point. It was again 3 to 4 months until I was walking in the neighborhood, and there have been so many setbacks since. I spent most of December of 2023 bedbound again after being a bit too ambitious for a week. My body improved before my mind, so my life lately has been like trying to wrangle an overenthusiastic toddler. But the toddler's myself, randomly moving things around my house and starting tasks, and then crashing. Reading and remembering information was, and is often still, a struggle. Brain fog is brain damage. I feel like that's not something explicitly stated often. And your neurons don't just regenerate. Doing too many mentally taxing things can cause a crash. Doing too many emotionally taxing things can cause a crash. Though I'm physically improving, exercise has become tricky. I notice whenever my heart rate goes up too high for too long, my symptoms return. Working out became a balancing act of making sure my heart rate wouldn't get too high, but still moving my body around enough to improve. You know what really gets your heart rate up? Sex. Something I don't see long COVID activists talking about much. Maybe because it's kind of taboo. But we here on the Leslie XP channel are sex positive. I'm trying to give you kiddos all the facts before you go out there, unprotected, raw dogging the air. During my first recovery period, once I had reached the point where I was able to go for walks, I made the mistake of having sex with my girlfriend at the time, and then I was stuck in the dark, uncontrollably shaking in bed for over a week. And not at all in a fun way. I quickly learned that any time I had an orgasm, there was a risk of a flare-up. I had to adapt how I exercise and how I experience intimacy for over a year before I began to feel able to consistently experience orgasm without a major risk of being incapacitated for days afterwards. This often required stopping in the middle of things and going weeks without any sexual activity at all. After the second time I had COVID, I stopped everything. Yes, even solo sexual activity, for 4 months. Which, honestly, wasn't hard to do. It wasn't really... it wasn't exactly a conscious choice. My girlfriend and I had broken up, and this may come as a surprise, near constant migraine, fatigue, and dysautonomia weren't exactly getting me in the mood. I tried to ease my way back into it, but definitely made some mistakes. I went from hiking up mountains and having regular sex with multiple partners to being bedbound for weeks at a time and unable to even touch myself. As you can imagine, this also led to a lot of anxiety surrounding intimacy. Long COVID had completely destroyed my work, my hobbies, my dating life, and my sex life. Even now, 1.5 years after my last infection, sex can still feel like a gamble. We tend to talk in terms of labor and work hours lost when discussing the toll of long COVID because that's simply how most of us conceive of ability. Or we talk from the perspective of caregivers, of course. Clearly, long COVID messed up my ability to do what little work I could already do, but it also severely impacted my ability to experience connection, joy, and pleasure. I often couldn't even text with my friends because I couldn't look at screens without exhausting myself and making all my symptoms worse. Hanging out in person was also not an option for obvious COVID safety reasons. I now have 2 people in my life I can trust to take precautions, but during the worst of it, I had no one. You see these images of people incapacitated in bed, but it's easy to separate yourself from them, to not really embody that experience, to not understand the depth of the impact, to not think that that could happen to you. I've been trying to make this video for over a year now because I keep having to stop and lie in the dark for hours, days. In December, it was weeks at a time. I'm doing better on average, but recovery has really not been a straight line. In very severe cases of long COVID, people may be hospitalized. They might be unable to swallow and have to rely on feeding tubes. I'm doing better because I got lucky. I had a moderate to severe case that became mild. I recognized my symptoms right away, and I was able to radically rest and pace myself because I had no obligations. I was able to get the supplements and meds that could give me the best chance at improvement. I've already spent a lot of my life sick, so I could manage my expectations and know what ableism to expect. I already knew the limitations of what doctors could do. I already understood my value was not tied to my health. But it still took a toll on me, physically and mentally. I struggle with regular suicidal ideation. I struggle knowing most people are doing nothing to protect me from getting severely ill again. I'm still not back to where I was before COVID, and I don't know if I ever will be. If I caught COVID for a 3rd time, I don't know if I would ever recover to this point. Millions of people haven't recovered at all. In the year following a mild COVID infection, that is, an infection that doesn't require hospitalization, your risk of death by any cause is an estimated 10 times greater than uninfected cohorts. Studies show COVID damages not only your brain, heart, blood vessels, and lungs, but your cells, particularly T cells, which are essential for immune function. Due to this immunity loss, COVID appears to make other diseases more likely and more deadly, diseases ranging from strep to fungal infections to cancer. Several researchers have gone so far as to compare COVID's immune effects to HIV. In fact, HIV drugs are being used to treat it in China right now. If you've had COVID 2, 5, 8 times and still feel fine and think you can catch it again and again without complications, you can't. And you're probably not as fine as you think you are. COVID has variable, cumulative, and long-lasting effects on every organ system in the body, even for people, even for children, with mild or asymptomatic infections. With each new infection, you're increasing the chances of brain damage, blood clots, stroke, heart attack, and immune damage, in addition to the less debilitating but still concerning erectile dysfunction and mood changes. You're basically playing Russian roulette with your health. You will never be immune to long COVID, no matter how many times you catch it, because that's simply not how immunity works. You're not building immunity by catching COVID, you're destroying your immune system. So I'll ask you again, how many times do you plan on catching COVID? There is a staggering amount of information on just how awful this is to catch, how dangerous reinfections are, and how we've normalized a lower baseline for health. If I were to go through it all, this video would be like an entire year long. For more on this, watch Lola Germ's excellent video called Why is Everyone More Sick? Protection 101. Do you really think billionaires are raw-dogging this pandemic because you see them maskless in pictures?
It's false. No way. Not this time.
They hire services like EventScan to test everyone prior to their events, and provide additional tests on site. They run industrial-sized HEPA filters, then, after events, use antiviral nasal sprays like Sterawave. They can pose maskless and pretend they haven't taken any precautions while standing directly in front of something filtering out 80 to 99% of circulating virus in the air. So now that you're going to take COVID more seriously, don't you want to know what else rich people are doing to protect themselves and what you, personally, can do? Well, let's start with seeing how they protect their children at school.
All individuals at Abrome, including guardians and visitors, will wear masks whenever we are indoors, and anytime we are close to one another outdoors. The only options for masks indoors are KF94s, KN95s, or N95s, or higher filtration masks or respirators.
COVID is airborne. That is, transmitted through particles like smoke. So masks with gaps, like cloth and surgical masks, are not so effective. Instead, you should wear a fitted respirator whenever possible. I recommend checking out this channel for fit testing and reviews. I personally find that the 3M Aura is a good fit. Disposable masks can be worn for 30 to 40 hours in a clean work environment before being discarded. If you're in a high-risk setting like a hospital, then they should only be worn for a day. Some people use the paper bag method to reuse their masks, rotating masks every 24 hours to increase longevity. Elastomeric masks are also an option. These are reusable and you can wear them as many times as you want, you just have to replace the filters. If you can't afford masks, find a local mask block with this map and see what they have available for free. Even surgical masks and cloth masks offer some protection if there's simply no way for you to access respirators. It's still better than not wearing anything.
Distancing. We will gradually decrease the number of people who can be indoors at any given time as local spread increases.
Most of the time, you can't really decide not to be near anyone at work or school. However, it's about reducing density and increasing ventilation. If you can be outdoors with fewer people, then hold your event or meeting outdoors with fewer people.
Quarantine and isolation. Our quarantine and isolation periods run at least 7 and 10 days, respectively, and include a test-out requirement.
Looks like this private school understands that the 5-day isolation period is bullshit, and people need to stay home for as long as they're testing positive on a PCR. Oh, now this is very interesting.
Paid sick time off. There is no limit to the number of days facilitators will stay home during the year for quarantine or isolation.
Well, well, well. Nice policy you have there. Wouldn't it be a shame if we decided to unionize about it? Ventilation and filtration.
We use CO2 monitor readings as a proxy for ventilation, and will vacate rooms if they hit 800 ppm.
Guess what? You can buy CO2 monitors and test your spaces as well. If you ever smoked or shit in someone else's home, then you already understand a bit about how ventilation works. Opening windows, turning on fans, increasing airflow, basically anything you do to get stench or smoke out of a room, other than Febreze, is very helpful for reducing circulating virus.
Filtration. Each room is equipped with at least one HEPA purifier or Corsi-Rosenthal box, producing an excess of 12 air changes per hour, ACH, in filtration. 12 ACH is the hospital isolation room standard.
A HEPA filter can remove an estimated 80 to 95% of circulating virus. Masking is still important, though, because if somebody is speaking directly into your face holes, then a filter on the other side of the room is only going to do so much. If you can buy filters for your home and/or push for filtration in your work or school, then do it. Here's a channel that reviews filters, a tool for selecting your own, and here's a tutorial on building a low-cost Corsi-Rosenthal box. However, a more effective way to clean the air might be upper room germicidal ultraviolet radiation, or URGUV. Many, if not most, locker rooms for professional sports teams are outfitted with ultraviolet disinfection systems. URGUV systems have been in use for over 80 years, so they're well understood and known to be safe. Experts in airborne transmission and infection recommend the use of URGUV systems to stop the spread, stating that masks, ventilation, and mechanical filtration may not be enough on their own. From this article, GUV inactivation of airborne tuberculosis bacteria was equivalent to 24 air changes per hour, well beyond the capacity of most mechanical ventilation systems and room air cleaners. Upper room GUV was about 9.4 times more cost-effective than mechanical ventilation for the same amount of air disinfection. URGUV systems are safe, well-researched, low-maintenance, low-energy, low-cost, and something I think every public space ought to have.
Surveillance testing. This year, we are adding daily LAMP, loop-mediated isothermal amplification, molecular surveillance testing. Each household of every enrolled person and facilitator will pool their samples each morning at home, and then those pooled samples will be tested after drop-off.
Guess what? You can also pool test to cut costs on frequent testing. Rapid COVID tests at pharmacies today have a negative reliability of only about 25%, which means if they say you're negative, it doesn't really mean anything at all. But, of course, if they say you're positive, then you definitely have COVID, so that's still useful. There are ways to improve the accuracy of the at-home testing kits. Instead of only swabbing your nose, swab your throat and mouth, then swab your nose, as instructed. Also, if you take 2 tests 48 hours apart. Throat swabs have been shown to detect positive results up to 2 days sooner than nasal swabs. This is also true for molecular testing. If you can afford it or push for it in a community space, molecular testing is far more accurate and easier to pull samples. Molecular tests require a much smaller viral load, and they'll detect infections days sooner than rapid ones, which may never even detect the infection at all. This PlusLife device is so sensitive that it'll detect infection usually before viral load is high enough for transmission. You get 98% accurate results in 35 minutes or less. This isn't a sponsored video, I wish it was, but my friends and I split the cost of the PlusLife, which can be used to test for other viruses as well, and it's been such a relief to have access to easy and accurate testing. It's pricey, but after the initial cost of the device, individual tests are only $8 a piece, and you can pull up to 4 samples per test. Links are in the resource document. Of course, if you're feeling sick, you should stay home. Stay home as much as possible, and do what you can to not pass your illness on to somebody else. This applies even if you don't have COVID. Please just stop getting other people sick. And remember, you're infectious 3 to 5 days before initial symptoms appear, and an estimated 40 to 60% of transmission is pre- or asymptomatic. So, it's generally a good idea to mask and test whether you have symptoms or not. Vaccines.
100% of our community is vaccinated and up to date on COVID vaccines.
If you're able, you should still be getting updated boosters every 6 months. Right now, in addition to Pfizer and Moderna, there's also a protein-based shot called Novavax, which appears to have comparable efficacy and generally fewer side effects than the mRNA vaccines. COVID shots work like flu shots. They offer some protection, but they won't entirely prevent it. Also, these vaccines are safer than aspirin. Don't listen to any fear-mongering. Additional protection. We know KISS uses nasal photodisinfection. Again, a thing that's too expensive for me to understand. But there are affordable over-the-counter nasal spray options with iota carrageenan that the average person can get, which appear to reduce viral load. CPC mouthwashes also show some promise. Links in my resource document. And good news for all you weed heads out there. Some studies suggest cannabinoids may offer some protection. No singular layer of protection is perfect. Ideally, you should aim to use as many layers as possible. Think back to the Swiss cheese model. If we picture every type of protection as a slice of Swiss cheese, some with more holes than others, then when you stack these slices together, most of the holes are covered. More slices of cheese means fewer holes in your protection. With all these layers of protection, you can minimize your risk of COVID significantly. And why not? Isn't it nice to not feel like shit? Who still cares about COVID? I still care about COVID, and so do plenty of other disability justice-informed people who are more active on social media than I am. My Google Doc of resources includes links to other creators and organizations which you can follow. But you should try to look around your local community and build connections and mutual aid networks there. I linked to a map in the description of local mask blocks and COVID safety orgs. Most major cities have at least one. Mask blocks exist for distributing PPE and information, but they also help COVID-conscious people build community with others who are being safe. If there's nothing anywhere near you on the map, there may be COVID-safe Facebook groups or communities to be found elsewhere. Or, of course, you can start your own. If you want this to exist, chances are there are other people around you who want it too. You don't have to wait for permission to start. I've included a guide in the resource doc for creating your own mask block. These groups exist, and if you can't find anything locally and don't have the spoons to make your own, then there are plenty of international COVID-safe hangout spaces online. It's depressing to feel so isolated, especially as a disabled person who can't afford to get sick. And it's important to build community and make connections with other people who understand. If you're not already, you should be listening to the Death Panel podcast. It was an invaluable resource for this video. It's an entire podcast about disability justice. If you like my videos, you'll love it. I also get a regular newsletter from the People's CDC and urge you all to get on their email list for their weekly weather reports. Conclusion. You might be thinking it's a bit tone-deaf to make this video while there's an ongoing genocide happening in Gaza. But if you're attending Palestinian liberation protests and donating to eSIM funds, like this one, which you should donate to right now, and you're not masking, then you don't understand settler colonialism and genocide. Spreading a deadly virus and shrugging your shoulders when it culls the weak is genocide. Mass disabling events that disproportionately affect marginalized communities are a form of settler colonial genocide. What do you think killed a significant proportion of indigenous people in the Americas? Disease and disablement have always been essential tools of imperialism. And we have a global economy. When you spread COVID locally, you increase the chances that people everywhere, including Gaza, will get it. When Palestinians get COVID, which many already have, how do you think they fare? What do you think was the point of bombing hospitals? If you're not protecting the most vulnerable people in your own community, you're not protecting vulnerable people in any community. Abled people, try to remember you're not invincible. COVID is not inevitable, and your community, including your disabled comrades, are worth protecting. Your mask does more than protect you. For instance, writer and activist Alice Wong had a tracheostomy, which means she doesn't breathe through her nose or mouth, and therefore can't wear a mask. She will die if she catches COVID, and depends on your mask to keep her safe. If you're not wearing one, then she can't go to the pharmacy. She can't go to the doctor. She can't go to your event without a significant risk of death. If you're not wearing a mask, then you've decided to exclude disabled people, like me and Alice Wong, from your spaces. If you don't wear a mask, then you don't truly believe in liberation for all. Disabled people, we have witnessed horrors. Now, more than ever, we're the canaries in coal mines, fainting at alarming rates, screaming with what little energy we have left that it's not safe, while able-bodied people resent us for it and trample over our bodies to poison themselves over and over until they, too, are fainting canaries. Unfortunately, we're going to have to do a lot of crypt dueling in the coming years, after letting out a few I told you so's. Remember, no matter how this pandemic has made us feel, no matter the obscene death of social murder we're having to endure, no matter how many people have dismissed our deaths or downplayed the severity of an illness that killed us or left us bedbound for months or years, your life is valuable. Your joy is valuable. You are worth fighting for. There's no shame in being less exploitable. Whew, alright, well that was a hoot and a holler. I promise I have some more intergaging and edutational videos planned for the future, but yeah, I'm still taking it slow right now and easing into things. I'm feeling a lot better than I was at this time last year. I'm cautiously optimistic and trying to be patient with myself. Anyway, if you like this content, then consider supporting me on Ko-fi and/or Patreon. You can donate once or cancel your subscription anytime. No pressure. I can't believe I still have patrons after not making anything for over a year, so double extra special thank you to Aaron, Agent Maxwell, Joseph Dawes Jr., Questing Refuge, Sidekick, and Oozeworm.